Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for Vital Voices from the Frontlines of Human Sexuality, a conversation with Dr. Bianca I Laureano and Dr. Ericka Burns. I'm Izzy Angus. I am the Public Events Manager for California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university on the unceded ancestral lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, which you may know as San Francisco. We are calling in and watching this conversation from all over, but as a representative of CIIS, I want to honor our gratitude and our debt to the Ramaytush Ohlone people for the land on which our campus sits and for being the continual caretakers and stewards of Yelamu. Yelamu being the Ramaytush word for both the people and the territory of the San Francisco Peninsula. This acknowledgement is the least that we can do, and it is a first step in cultivating a deeper relationship with Indigenous tribes, people, and organizations where we live. I actually invite you to call out in the chat where you're calling in from and who the Indigenous caretakers are of the lands from where you live. And if you're early in your journey, you're not sure, and would like a starting resource, I recommend the website native-land.ca. Before we start, a few admin items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight, so please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. Our presenters will answer questions from that form, and we will try to get to as many as we have time for. We also have automatically generated captions, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat is enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see the chat. If you choose to participate, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. Chat is not required to fully experience the event, and you can turn the chat off at any time. And we actually encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience of the event in any way. If you're having issues with your audio or video, we suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you still have issues, try adjusting your video settings from within YouTube. Now, let me introduce our presenters, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Ericka Burns is the founder and executive director of Sacramento Peers on Prevention, or SACPOP, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating youth about sexual health and reproductive justice. Dr. Burns began conducting research on the effectiveness of peer-to-peer interventions in 2009, and by 2011 created a youth peer educator HIV training program. This program was created to effectively train youth on how to become risk reduction counselors in both clinical and outreach settings. And this was also a way to measure increased knowledge and healthy behavior changes. Since 2011, Dr. Burns has continued to implement this program with the SACPOP Youth Peer Educator Program. Dr. Burns' work has expanded to support various reproductive health organizations across the nation. This work includes assisting with the development, implementation, and evaluation of their sexual health programs and services related to the advancement of health and racial equity. Dr. Burns is also a community activist and focuses their work on creating anti-racist sex education, advocating for the rights of marginalized folks, and specializes in reproductive justice, health equity, sexual health, HIV and STI prevention, peer education, and sexual pleasure. Dr. Bianca I Laureano is an award-winning educator, curriculum writer, and sexologist. She is a founding member of the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, and her most recent project is Anti-Up, a virtual freedom school offering professional development and certification for sexuality professionals. She has written several curricula focusing on communities of color and is the editor of the People's Book of Human Sexuality, Expanding the Sexology Archive. She is an ASEC certified sexuality educator and supervisor. You can find out more about Bianca at her website, biancalaureano.com, and about Anti-Up at www.antiuppd.com. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Laureano and Dr. Burns.
Right, it's so true. Yeah, I'm good. It's so good to be here with you. I love seeing your face.
Same. I'm really excited for this conversation. I know we talked before, but I have to say publicly on the World Wide Web, I'm such a fan. And I'm so glad that you chose me to have this conversation with you. And let me tell you, I already told you, I've gone through this book, highlights and everything, snacks all between the the pages. So I am very, very excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Me too. Me too.
Nice. Well, I want to get us started in really just kind of the how, like what was the development process of this book, why create this book, and we can start there, and then we can add on to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I submitted the application or book submission during the pandemic. So it was 2020, and it took me 6 months to write that. So I like to start there so people know it did not happen overnight. It took me a while. I had the information before the pandemic even started, and so that just slowed it down a little bit more. But it did take a moment for me to pull it all together. But the conversation that I had with the editor at the time, who was a young white woman, she's probably like in her early 30s, was, what book do you want to write? And I was like, I really want to write something that is kind of like a throwback to like our childhood where we had like access to encyclopedias and people could just pull a volume and be like, let me read about the bees. And so I imagined and envisioned something like that where it would be this expansive archive with updated volumes and completely new information. And so she was like, let's start with one. And and I told her, I was like, I also wanted there to be embedded some lesson plans so that people know how to teach and have conversations and do activities around the content of each chapter. And for that reason, I was like, I imagine it as like a textbook of the future. So I knew like what we were creating 4 years ago, or what I was pitching 5 years ago, was still going to be so forward in the ways that we think about text and the ways that we think about learning from text. So yeah, it took me a while to pull it together, but I think it's also important to share for people who are in the writing process or thinking about a book that what I submitted, probably like 75% still accurate. Like there's stuff that just didn't make it into what I submitted or things changed. But yeah, the goal primarily was to get the brilliance from people in our human sexuality field who are all people of the global majority who have never been invited to publish and yet have been doing the work for decades. And so I intentionally went to people who were like, what, you want to write with me? What do you mean you want me to write a chapter? And who were interested, but also probably needed a little bit more support and care in the writing process. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I think when you go through the book, it is very, for me, like, yes, there are the lesson plans, and we can go into that later too. As an educator, I'm such a fan of the lesson plans. I was like, yes, we need to break that down. But we get to have intimate conversations throughout the book. A lot of folks are bringing their personal experiences. And I do want to definitely call out, which is called out throughout the book, when you mentioned how things change, the biggest thing that changed was COVID. And a lot of folks, there was a really, really good section with the conversation with you and Saifa about grief. And that kind of showed up throughout the book. And I'm curious on what you pitched 5 years ago, what was happening during the process, with you, your writers, and how folks were navigating grief and the change of COVID, how it affect this book.
Yeah, it's so important to also highlight that, like I said, like these were people who just didn't have an invitation to the table, to the writing space. They knew about it, but they just never saw themselves immediately in that space. And so it's a very exclusive environment, right? And the publisher is an academic publisher. So reaching out to like community educators and scholars and activists who were not celebrated in an academic setting, that I knew was going to be different and new. And so the care that really went into not just selecting people, but honoring people's yes or no or maybe throughout the entire process, I think is really the important component that I learned about when it comes to like creating a culture of consent with other people. Because I reached out to several people, and some people were really quick to respond because again, this was pre-pandemic, and other people took a while. And some people were just like, I can't do it. I'm really flattered, but I just can't do it. And other people were like, absolutely yes. Others were like, let me think about it. And some people just didn't even respond. And maybe they did like 8 months later. I was like, we have already started. Like it, next time. And so I knew that we would need to create not just organization and cohesion, but also some transparency about what's my role as the editor, what's my relationship to the editor at the publisher, what's the information I can give them. So this is not a traumatizing experience, so knowing how the academy has traumatized us and also protecting them a little bit from any of the stuff that might bump up against it because of an academic publisher. So we did some really traditional stuff when the pandemic started, such as writing hours. So I would have like writing time with them, and I would send them like reminders and invitations, and it was drop in. If you wanted to do it, you would do it. I encourage them to write anything, like just put anything on the paper. It doesn't have to be full sentences. Like just get your ideas, get an outline. And also like don't delete anything. Like if there's something that you're thinking about, just add it, but like, make it a running list of ideas and concepts that you want to bring in. And then we did like editing together. So I met with them one-on-one virtually, like on a Zoom platform. We went through the articles and chapters that they were contributing to. And then we also did work through like the Google Suite, right? So we used almost 100% free resources to build this. And it was great, so we would talk in the comments of a document, or we would spend some time together talking through it. And, through that process, a couple of people were like, I can't write this. Like, I know I said yes, but I cannot write. I need to back out. For a variety of reasons, right? And so that was, sad. And also it's part of the honoring people's consent and no, and also representing like the sustainable approach to doing this work.
Right.
So there was that happened for some people. And then for other people, they were just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm having a hard time writing. I still want to contribute, but I don't know what to do. And with those people, the block or the capacity issue was really more like they didn't want to do it alone in many ways. So with those people, we hopped on a Zoom, we turned on the transcription, and we had a conversation. And so the entire third part of the book is really from the Zoom transcription. And either we kept it as a conversation, so like with Saifa and Juan, or the contributors turned our conversation into their chapter. So that was what Bina and Nakia did. And, they just, all of them have such important contributions to share. I was like, there's no way I'm letting Nakia not talk about this in the book. Like, there's just no way. So, So yes, it was a lot of like care, a lot of time. I asked for 2 extensions
Mm.
from the publisher. I think that's important to say. I think a lot of people are like worried about the timelines, and it's like life happens. And just telling them every single step of the way, like this is what's going to happen next. This is the information I'm going to get. You know, this is how I'm going to communicate with you. You don't have to do anything right now, or you will in a moment. So really organized. Like I built an archive for this archival project.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. I can keep talking, but I want to pause, take a sip
Oh
of
no. I mean, oh yes, drink of water. No, I really appreciate that. It really just sounds like you created a space for people to learn, to grow, to explore, for folks who may not have published anything for the first time. This is their opportunity. They may have, inspired a writing bug in them. Um, and I have to say, just, that type of care is rare. Sometimes you're invited and then it's just like, I have a deadline, give me your submission, and then I'll never see the edits until like a week before. You got to look at the edits, and then publishing, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is, yeah, I guess this is what I wrote.
Yeah, exactly. It's like there's such a disconnect really from what you write. And I've been in those situations, and every editor has a different approach. So
Mhm.
not to like diss anybody that I've worked with before, that's how it worked for them. And it worked for me in that space. But I knew that I wanted to do it differently. I knew that I wanted to be guided by this like enormous feeling of love and respect and care for like just the tenderness that we deserve that we rarely
Mhm.
ever get. And just because of the way that I know that people have treated us
Yeah.
in this field and the way that we really have been disregarded and silenced. And that's really the reality for many of the participants is a lot of them were silenced because people were just like, we don't want to hear it in their classrooms, in their training
Mm.
programs, in their supervision sessions with people if they needed to get licensure. So all of that, I think, played a really big role in the reason why I chose the very hands-on approach that I did. And it wasn't about not trusting people, but I knew that like these individuals said yes to me because of our relationship, right?
Mm.
Like they said yes because they trusted me. And I'll be honest, like I didn't get a lot of money. Like I didn't make money until after the book was done, and then like half a year of selling. But the money that I did get up front, I offered to the writers. And I was like,
Mhm.
I can offer you this little bit of money. You can take it, you can tell me to donate it, or you can put it back in the pot where other writers, I can split it among the writers who do need the money.
Mhm.
And so instead of offering people like $50, which is what it started as, I was able to offer, some authors $150, $200.
Mhm.
That felt a little bit better. But there were people who were like, I'm saying yes to this and I don't need the money. So,
Mm.
do something else with it. Give it to somebody else, donate it here. I think that's a really important and powerful piece that really speaks to the collaborative approach and the ways that people reminded me, like one of the author in the second chapter, Jadlyn, I would talk to her about it. I was like, I just was really embarrassed to like
Mm.
ask her to do something for $50, right? Like I would never tell any of
Yeah.
my people do it for $50. Yeah, and Jalen was like, Bianca, but you let us say yes or no. Like we knew and we said
Mhm.
yes. And so that was our choice. If you really want to invest in this culture of consent, you gotta then like not take our choice away by
Mhm.
making an assumption that it's too little money. You didn't take that away from us. You reached out to us, you offered it to us, you let us say what we wanted to do with it. And that was a really helpful, powerful reminder.
Mhm.
That really helped me, just ease whatever felt bruising and disrespectful about not
Yeah.
being able to pay people for their labor.
Right. No, I definitely understand that. And on top of that, I have to say, I just think you just take care of people. And I just think that's so important. Like, I know that we talked and you said that you were happy that I joined. I was like, what do you mean? It's a hell yeah. Like, sign me up that
Yeah.
I could speak with you and have this conversation. Don't even ask, put my name on the list. That's fine. Because I think that the care that you have shown with different educators and different folks in the field, it's you're helping plant seeds and you're seeing them blossom, and then you cultivate it and you made this wonderful book. And it does feel painful that when we talk about the lack of pay, the lack of notice, the privilege that it is to publish, the privilege to get our voice out into certain spaces, it's like we don't get a lot of opportunities, but you gave folks an opportunity. So I do want to give you kudos on that and how you took care of folks. And that's needed in this work. We need more of that if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, it's one of those interesting things where people are always like, so I'm child free by choice. And people have always throughout my life been like, but you should have babies. Don't you want to have a family? Blah, blah, blah. And people finally stopped when I turned 40, 6 years ago. But I feel like this is the stuff that I want to nurture and raise and care for. It's other people's brilliance and other people's opportunities to really not have such the hard time that I did. Like, so when I thought about like, oh, who do I want to have be with me in this conversation? Like, who would really, one, enjoy the experience, but also who do I think would give people an opportunity? Like, this is a real privileged space for people to be in.
Yes.
Like, these are, you know, we're two homegirls talking about our work in this field that has been a challenge. And so yeah, so I was really deliberate about choosing people that had connections with CIIS and also knew the field and were also people of the global majority. And you know, you're a Black femme, and so those are all, you know, I'm a Black femme supremacist. Anyways, so that was a very easy choice too. And you know, with your work being a faculty member in the Human Sexuality doctoral program, that was also important for me to bring in that knowledge and your experience being an alumna from that program as well. So yes, it was a super easy decision to have you at the top of the list to reach out to.
Why, thank you. You know, I'll do anything. I actually do want to pivot on that as we're talking about the institutions. And you brought, I think my count is at 3 or 4 when you quote, white spaces have never been safe for us. When we're thinking about institutions, even CIIS, you know, we're here to have an honest conversation. But for the most part, across the board, I mean, these institutions are primarily led by white folks. Faculty are mostly white. The scholars that we read are mostly white. Sometimes it takes courage to be like, hey, don't forget this, you know what I'm saying? Or these are new scholars or new ideas that come out. And as we look at that, reading some of the passages of people's experiences of harm, whether it was sexual harm, racial violence, it's a lot of stuff that is packed on to that. So I'm curious in reading, knowing where we're at in this position, you have the lesson plans, and the lesson plans will primarily be taught in primarily led white institutions. How would you want your work to be translated in the way that you are intending it? You know what I'm saying? So I'm curious about that dynamic and how we make sure that the lesson plans and you know what I'm saying, all the work is being translated in a way that makes folks feel supported and safe and seen within the work.
Absolutely. You know, it's one of those things that you know, I'd shared with you a couple of weeks ago where like you're like the second wave of scholars who are trained with degrees in human sexuality who are then being hired, whether it's adjunct, lecturer, professor, whatever, status in those programs. Like there was a wave before you of people maybe 5 years younger or around the same age. And so it's very new, you know, like I couldn't get jobs unless I went into like traditional programs like sociology or psychology or urban studies or whatever it is. And so that was new and different. And so I went in knowing like the people who are being hired in our field, the people who are still there, who are full professors, who are probably not going to leave, whether they have emeritus status or not, those are all primarily cis heterosexual white people, and many of them women. And so I knew that it was going to be white women who wanted to teach our work. Many of them do want to be in solidarity with us, but they don't always get it right. And so what are the ways that we can offer not just white people in the academic field, but also like community educators who are just starting their career, and they have is a library card. They can go to the library, get this book, and be like, let me learn how I can talk about guiding people through a meditative process. What are some ways that I can bring in my yoga training to help people connect with the earth? You know, like, those are all just a taste of some of the lesson plans and activities that are throughout the chapters. And I think that was the really important part, was not just to make it accessible to one group of people, but acknowledging that there are people who do use this and need it, and what are the ways that we can make it accessible for all of them to do the work that they know they are called on to do and want to do it well. And so, I would say that maybe the lesson plans were probably one of the harder parts for some of the authors, because some of them had never written a lesson plan before. Some of them were like just exhausted. They were like, how about you draft it? And then I'll like edit. And that was how a lot of it went primarily. But everybody was very clear about, this is what I want people to teach about this. So I want us to talk about, what feelings sound and smell and feel like, not just talking about what it looks like. I think that was really a part of the social emotional component of weaving that in throughout every lesson plan, but also the fullness of each participant when they wrote, and each contributor as they wrote their piece, because they are very much from a first person perspective. And I think that's important. It's also deeply rooted and founded in like feminist praxis, right? It's a very feminist theoretical approach to do standpoint theory. It's a Black feminist, approach to say you get to theorize based on your lived experience. And so we definitely are using many of those approaches. It's also just the legacy of storytelling and oral histories that we find, not just within our cultural communities, but also even within the movements that we're a part of. So like reproductive justice very much centers storytelling. And so, for people who are like, oh, that's just like it's just an elective book, or that's just a book for like the, whatever, the class that's not that important. I want to be very clear that like, this is an academic publisher for a reason. They didn't just, grab me and say, just write whatever you want. They kind of did, but I knew that there had to be a foundational component. And I know how other books are written in our field, and they are not like this. They are not written like this. They don't tell you clearly what the framework is. They don't tell you clearly how it's connected to a legacy of other brilliance and other forces for change and resistance. And I wanted to make it really clear, like, this book belongs in ethnic studies, this book belongs in sociology, it belongs in human sexuality, but it also belongs in gender studies. Like, it fits in so many ways. In many ways, it's a shapeshifter. And, so now it fits in library sciences because it's an archive. So, thinking more expansively about where the book can be and how the contributors really demonstrate the interdisciplinarity of our field was really, really important, because there's some people who are like, human sexuality, that's great. And they just want to study like biology and psychology. And I'm like, but if you're forgetting the anthropology, if you're forgetting the poetry, like, are you really doing human sexuality if you don't even know the songs or
the arts? And no, I love that. I think, and I think a lot of folks, hopefully y'all have read the book, and if not, get it, some little QR. But I think a lot of people will get that. And I think what people miss, especially with textbooks, everything has to be around data, quantitative. We forget the qualitative. We forget conversation. And culturally, conversation is how we pass on history, how we pass on stories. That's how, honestly, we have survived, right? And so I think and we could talk about why you chose to do it in 3 parts. We could get into that right now, because I know at the end, there is beautiful conversation that is happening, and it's still data for the data folks. It's still relevant, it's still it has its same heaviness as any part of a textbook. It's not just, because sometimes we're just stuck in theory. We forget the practice. We got to know how to do it. How do we apply this? So I'm curious on how you took the 3 parts and how you decided to build those 3 parts and then end on a conversation.
Yeah. It's interesting because I know so many people who go through like education programs, whether they're academic or certificate or like therapeutic ones or education. And they're like, I learned all this information, but I don't know how to practice it. Like, I don't know how to do therapy. I don't know how to teach a lesson plan, And so that practical element was something that I really wanted to fill in the huge gaps that exist still in our field. And so when inviting people, so looking at the people who said yes to contributing, it just was a very easy understanding of like how to bulk them together and bunch them into sections, and then all the sections, they flow into each other. And we intentionally, I chose to have the chapters be standalone. So if someone, opens the book and they're like, wait a minute, I don't want to start with the first chapter, I'm going to go straight to the sex worker and what she has to say and what her lesson plan looks like. And so I think those are important to highlight, that like we intentionally did it as a non-linear book, right? So it's not like, oh, if I skip to page 300, I'm going to miss something. No, that's how traditional textbooks are built. But with this one, we're like, no, no, no. You could start anywhere, go to Canada, go to Mexico, like, you know, say somewhere in the US. It's a very North American text, which I think is also important. It's not just a USian based text. It's really all of North America. And so thinking about just the repetition. So you had said, like you say often, like these white spaces aren't safe for us. They weren't built for us, so of course they're not going to be safe for us. But that repetition is part of like my educator approach. Like we have to repeat ourselves in certain ways if we want people to really get the point that we're trying to share. And I think that's one of the reasons why I say that so much, but also the first chapter or the first sections are about safety and care. And so really bringing in our approach to building the book together and our collaborative, you know, goals for how we talk about safety and how we don't just view it as one person's responsibility. It is a collective responsibility. And so, you know, you and I are not the only ones to make sure that this is a quote unquote safe environment. It's also the participants. It's also the background crew. All of us are here to make this experience. And I think those are the really useful ways to think about like the safety piece. And so that's one piece that really stands out for building that first part. The second part, I think it's called Movement for Our Body Minds. And that one was where we really bring in the really specific and what people would consider traditional activist experiences. So we have people who never want to work in the academy and who are literally, yeah, exactly. And who are literally offering sex education in their communities and doing it better than some evidence-based curriculum. And we know that in our communities, we know that's how it works. So inviting people to talk about those experiences while also recognizing that like people read our bodies, right? Like, so we don't have the privilege of like navigating a space and not worrying about what we're wearing, you know, how, I mean, now it's like how our hair looks, all the pieces where people racialize us, they look at our tattoos, the way we adorn or decor our bodies, they make up stories about us. And so I knew that, and I've known that I'm 6 feet tall, like, and so knowing that I'm towering over students when they're seated, that feels really like a power move for many people. So just being clear about like that piece, but also recognizing like our bodies are going to change, right? We are in changing bodies. And I don't know about you, but I've been so mad at the way that I was trained in 1996 to think about bodies, where they're like, oh, puberty is the only change. No.
Yeah.
Our bodies are constantly changing, especially with climate chaos. Anyway, so, you know, really bringing in not just disability, but also changing bodies and how that impacts the way that we think about caring for other people and doing the work that we do, right? So Jessica is, her chapter is in that section. She's a nurse and she's also a menopause coach. And she has a Black mom, she's biracial. And so her chapter is not only about being a Black nurse and caring for Black people, but it's also about the knowing of how they see each other, but also her fear of her mother dying. And, you know, what does it mean when nobody else is going to know I'm Black because my mother is now dead, right? And those are like the important reminders, I think, for people that we can talk about this stuff, that this is what's on our minds. And yeah, it's not for everybody to engage with at all. But it's important for people to know that like our grief shows up in ways that are complicated. And it's complicated because of the racial formation in this country. It's complicated because of the way colorism exists. It's complicated for all the elitism and more. And so those kinds of shares were deeply in the book, but also Sarah's chapter, you know, Sarah Flowers talking about being a mom, talking to her young, you know, tween child who's witnessing anti-abortion extremists march in the streets, and she can now read their signs, and she's like, what does this mean? And so Sarah really talking about like, this is how our family thinks about body autonomy. And this is why those people are angry. And here's what we would say to those individuals or why we believe this. And doing it in such an accessible way to demonstrate that you can have these conversations with 9-year-olds. Like they get it. they understand it, and we're really doing a disservice rooted in adult supremacy when we don't allow that conversation with them. So like that one is, the middle chapter is really, I don't want to say it's all over the place, but it is. It's a range of different experience and approaches to doing the work and being in bodies that we have. And the final chapter are the oral narratives. So that's those chapters don't have accompanying lesson plans because there's just so many good oral narrative storytelling lesson plans that you can find.
Oh, you can pull, yeah. And even within those conversations, I was like, oh, I could pull this, I could pull that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you can read that and easily be like, oh, Nakia is talking about fashion and being a social worker and connecting with your staff and your clients by acknowledging the way that they're adorning and decoring their body. And it's that's an intersectional approach. It's a relational approach. I think though that's why I was like, there's no way, Nakia, I'm not gonna let you like get out of this book. Like we need you to write. But also having people talk about how they collaborate across communities. And that's what the chapter from our team in Mexico, Vulgar with Melina and Sucia, they write about who they collaborate with, and they write about how their manifesto looks when they do this sex at work in Mexico City.
Yeah.
So it's a range of things, but it's also, I don't know, it keeps you interested, I think, because it's not so similar every chapter.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It is refreshing because you get a different perspective. I get to go somewhere different. I get to see what different cultures are, how their conversations are. I remember in Karen's chapter about the grandmother as an unlikely ally, and what a coming out process could be in that experience. And I was just like, okay, like, how can how can saying, well, whatever they say, what did they mention, basically, hopefully they're supporting you, or if they don't, like, who cares about them, kind of thing. And their parents saying, do you want me to tell your family, because if I don't, then they won't know that I support you, and I support you. It's like, it's fine, because my sister identified as queer, or how did they identified like that. I think that's what the quote was. And it's just like how these different generations and different communities talk. And I think I sat within the section too for a minute, because it was just hearing people's individual stories and their connections, and how even with the conversation with Sarah about how they looked at abortion, which is very timely, obviously, within the generation, with how her mom talked about it, and then now with their daughter. And I'm just like, that's what a beautiful conversation. And it wasn't hard, and I think that, I don't know if you get this a lot, but the question of how do I be a sex educator? I'm like, half the time you already are, like most of the time you already are. You're already having the conversation. It's the conversations you have with the kids in your community, your kids, if you want to, family members, extended family or chosen family. How do we engage in these conversations? And I think that sometimes putting ourselves in a box of this title or whatever the case may be, is like, this is everyday work, this is everyday living. And yeah, that section it sat with me for some time too, because I was like, this is very interesting to kind of go back and review some of that too. So
and I think with Sarah's chapter especially, it's about abortion, so it really invites us to think about how does our training as sex professionals weave in abortion, if at all? Because I know when I was being trained in 1996 and throughout, there was no conversation about abortion. It was kind of this default that you would figure it out. But we had tons of classes about sex and pregnancy, or pregnancy and fetal development, or whatever else, chest feeding, breastfeeding. And, but we can't have a conversation about abortion. Like, it's not anywhere in the curriculum. Right. And I want to rectify that. I want to correct it, especially after the Dobbs decision. There is absolutely no way. I don't understand how some of these programs are training sex educators and not talking about abortion. So really, helping us think through what is possible, but also this book in that chapter and that lesson plan is really a gift for, people who are department heads or, leading these certificate programs, because it's really an opportunity for you to think about, oh, how can I weave this in? Because it's missing, it's missing.
Yes.
And that, that for me is what it means to correct the archive, to expand it, to acknowledge it. Like, it shouldn't be that our field is promoting birth only. We don't even talk about miscarriage either, right?
I
So
was just gonna say that.
so like that to me is just like huge barrier. So we're not talking about perimenopause. We just started talking about the internal clitoris like 5 years ago. So
Right.
like why is it like that?
Mhm.
So yeah, so it's also really acknowledging that this is a gift. The work that we did, I value it. But it's also not just a reminder, but it's like a calling on for other people to
Mhm.
do better because we've been doing better. You just don't let us shine in the spaces that we have to share with y'all.
Can we talk about it? That's why we're here, actually.
Right, exactly.
No, when talking with youth around you talk through puberty, you do that stuff. But the conversation, I think it was a couple of years ago, we created a campaign and it was around how come people don't talk about pregnancy loss or miscarriage. It's always
Mhm.
like if you have sex, you will have a baby. And it's like that easy? Like boom.
Right.
A lot of people have a lot of there's folks with infertility issues. We don't talk about infertility. We don't talk about miscarriage. We don't talk about we don't talk about none of these things. And
Mhm.
it's like we have never had comprehensive sex education without that information. It has never been comprehensive.
Right.
And I know that we're trying our best and we're trying to fill in the gaps of what we're missing and what we wish we knew. And there's still more information that we're
Right.
missing
Right.
because it's so vast. Like for schools, colleges, however it works, if they only get a week, a day to talk about sex and
Right.
sexuality, I don't even think
Mhm.
they talk about sexuality, but
Right.
it
Right.
limits us. And so we need this work now. So now we're having adult sex education in a different perspective, but almost like relearning everything,
Mhm.
relearning our own bodies. And you mentioned going through perimenopause and menopause. Nobody talks about that either. You're just supposed
Right.
to know from your friends.
Right. Like our generation is the one that's finally changing that and talking
Yes.
more openly about it and pushing medical providers to think and learn more. And the new research that's developing. I mean, we're literally living in the future, right? Like I
Yes.
remember I was born and grew up in a world that didn't have HIV. And now it's a totally different scenario. And now we have COVID. So, thinking about how all those things are connected to sex, sexuality, activism, eugenics,
Yeah.
disability, those are all the pieces that I think definitely show up in the book, but are important to our field and for us to really consider. Because if we want to stay relevant and continue to do amazing work, we got to continue to grow and evolve. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of people who don't want to.
Yes.
They know who they are. And this book is maybe not for them if they want to stay in that space. But those are also the people that remind me, what kind of elder do I want to become?
Mm.
Because I want to become an elder that listens to young people, that doesn't have to talk to be right, but wants to communicate to be understood. And someone who is learning, oh, I don't want to, let me remember not to behave like that because this is how it's coming across, right? So
Right.
good examples for me to like remember how I want to show up in the world and continue to be someone that other people, want to work with and collaborate with, but also someone who can sit back and lead,
Mhm.
and allow other people to lead them, not just lead. But my leading days are kind of over. Like I really want to be in a space where I'm ready to learn from younger people who got the energy to do it in a different way, people who have often been excluded as well, even in
Mhm.
my attempt here. Like I can tell you all the people who are excluded because the book can't do it all, right? So
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that certain people weren't reached out to. It just means they couldn't do it at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, that's unfortunately the field that we
Mhm.
have inherited, but we get to change it. And so
Yes.
hopefully this book is one of those attempts to make that change for
Mhm.
sure.
I've definitely said this before. I'll follow the youth anywhere. Like, I mean, when you think about major social movements, they're led by the youth. They're led by young people, college age, high school age students that are really driving for. They don't even have to be in high school or college, but they are really driving these movements. And we push them to the side. We push them to the side, and it's just like we have been right this whole time. But I feel you on the energy though, because like I said, now I'm ready to follow the youth,
Yeah.
not lead as a youth.
Yes.
So y'all
Yeah.
tell me what I got to do.
Right.
Speaking of, actually, you mentioned a lot around, especially in the first chapter, around media literacy and connecting. Now, when we're talking about youth leadership and looking at archiving our work, and how do we balance those two? I mean, we have a lot of young folks that are using social media to empower, to lift up, to gather, or even boycott and educate. And of course, there's always some areas of media where mis and disinformation, especially around contraception and abortion right now. But how can we use media within, the context of your book? How can we use media within the context of even adapting lesson plans or lesson planning within media that we can use as a tool?
Yeah. I love media. I'm definitely a product of love and popular culture, growing up in the 90s. So, when I think about the impact that it's had on my life, not only am I grateful, but I'm also even more grateful that I didn't have the technology that the young people have today, where things are being documented in the same way. Yeah. Just the idea of privacy, right? But it's a different engagement with privacy. And it's a challenge around thinking about body autonomy that allows them to practice and mess up and, make mistakes without harming other people, including themselves. But I think it's such an important conversation to have. And I'm always surprised at how late the human sexuality field was to incorporating media literacy as a core educational approach. Now, if you do like an internet search looking for, research, sure, you'll find stuff from maybe 10 years ago. That's not enough. 10 years ago was 2014, y'all. That is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
I graduated high school in 1996 and was talking about here's what I'm learning from TLC and Salt and Pepper, and here's, and people today want to still quote that Salt and Pepper, let's talk about sex song. And I'm just like, y'all don't even know how they treated Spinderella. Y'all don't even know anything else from their archive. And so that to me is now like a red flag when people are like, let's talk about sex. I'm like, you don't know.
You don't know nothing.
Salt and Pepper and hip hop, right? So for me, I'm like, y'all are just so leaning on and dependent on not just the products of Black communities, but also not even weaving in an opportunity to consider the way that we're being exposed to messages and information. And that to me is a form of adult supremacy that definitely sets young people up to fail. And so, the first lesson plan in the book is for a chapter that I wrote about media literacy and how it just burns my biscuits that people right now will skip over media literacy and go directly to porn literacy conversations. Not that that's not important, but you can't just jump into the deep end immediately. You got to take a couple of steps back, and media literacy gives us a foundation which porn literacy is based on. So why are we jumping instead of really getting this historical understanding? So it's part of that, but also one of the first activities is to have participants engage with the book as an object, objectify this book. What does it smell like? What does it feel like between your hands? What do you see on the cover? What do you think the cover image means? All of that was intentional, right? The title of the book was not what I proposed 4 years ago, right? I created that and communicated with a lot of different people. So it was intentional to want to call it the People's Book, right? That was an intentional, reference to the collaboration and community work. And so was the image on the cover, right? So inviting people to really sit and be like, oh, why do I see black and grays and sparkling gold? What does this remind me of? Where does it take me? And inviting people to look at abstract art is also an entry point for abstract theory, right? Where we don't always have to know the answer. We get to sit with not just discomfort, but also being unsure. And I think that's not something that we nurture enough as we're being trained, is to sit with what does it mean to be unsure? What does it mean to really think a little bit longer? That to me is a sustainability piece. Why are we rushing through so much? That's not sustainable. People are not going to get the information, and we're not going to get the experience that we want and also want to offer. So yeah, for me, objectifying the book was also a questioning also of the way that we talk about sexualization and objectification has always been so negative. And yet we never consider, how do some people find power in being objectified? What does it mean when they control the gaze and how people are receiving them? That's powerful, right? And I think that is what we miss when we don't bring in a media literacy piece. And so I was like, let's put the book behind your head, sit on it, do something with it. And then talk about what it was like to do that, make it into something more than a book. Write in the margins, that's what my copy looks like.
Oh yeah.
And so all of that being like a core part, like that's also making media. And I would even argue that's media justice, the opportunity that we get to have to make our own messages and make the messages that we want to share. And that could be from like how I put on makeup to what t-shirt I'm wearing to writing a book or a poem. And yeah, so to me, it's almost like I don't know another way to do the work beyond incorporating media literacy. It's kind of the same, like I don't know how to do the work without folding in standpoint theory or Black feminist thought, or like I don't know how to do it, and I don't want to know. I think we were trained on how they did it without all of that, and
and it's not
it
working.
didn't work. Yeah, it didn't work then. It's not working now. It is old and tired.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I felt that way. I don't know if you read the taste of brown sugar. It's by Mariel Miller Young.
Oh,
it talks,
yeah.
you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So that was an interesting take on kind of like the history of the views of porn, but in a pleasure gaze, like looking like I enjoy this. And I think people get so shocked when they're like, oh, and I totally agree. I think when it comes to media, I had to use media for my own dissertation because there's not enough research. I had to pull from Twitter. I had to pull from online interviews. I quoted Janelle Monáe calling herself a free ass motherfucker. I'm like, what if I love that as an identity. What if that's something we could put on our little boxes? Right. Be gay, straight, free ass motherfucker. I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's like the core part of like, that's us building stuff, right? So your dissertation, that's media, like your dissertation defense, that was media. So I think sometimes we forget that it's all around us and all of us are media creators, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And we might want to use words like influencer, it's an easier connection, but writing the menu for your meal plan for the week, that's media making too. It's all around us all the time, just like consent. And so if we're not really honoring all the way that it shape shifts and looks and feels and sounds, are we really even doing the work at the end of the day? Because it's not hard to consider it. It just is another layer. And I think some people are like, I don't want to, right? Which is fine. They get to make that choice. But there's consequences to not wanting to engage with the scholarship that's evolving the field.
Right. Even our language around media has changed. We can't even just post anymore. It's your content or how you're curating something. And it's just like, I just want to post my family reunion.
Exactly. Right. So, I want to give you my opinion. Yeah.
So for folks, we have 10 more minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them. So, but feel free to, we're going to continue to engage, but if y'all have any questions, please put them in the form so we can ask those questions. So for me, I think some final takeaways is that throughout the book, I felt that there was a lot of self-reflection for me, a lot of pauses. Like I said, I sat with some sections. I sat with some of the chapters a little bit longer than others. And I'm like, oh, let me come back to that. And I feel like as a reader, it was really nice to even have a pause, I think, in the middle of the book where I think it was quoted, it was like, dear reader, we're tired and we know you're tired too. And I'm just like, and I know that in the context it was around COVID, but I mean, like just in life, we're trying to do our best. We're trying to do the best we can with the tools we have, with the resources that are available to us. And I'm curious around your own self-reflection as you went through, edited, and I know you have a more intimate personal connection with the authors and the chapters, but I'm curious about your personal reflection of the book and kind of like you're standing back and looking at your masterpiece. How do you see it now?
Yeah, it's interesting. The book definitely follows like this legacy of femmes of the global majority having a very long introduction to like explain why their work is valid and really like ground it in these theoretical concepts and activist spirits and more. And so it definitely, like, I don't know how long it is, maybe it's like 30 pages long, but that's partly because I wrote 2 different intros. Like, so writing an intro in 2020 was very different than writing an intro in 2022. You know, it was a different planet. We had lost millions and millions of people. We're still losing thousands and thousands of people every day to COVID infection and long COVID and disabling experiences. And, you know, not just the vision didn't change in the book, but the way I was thinking about, we're still in process of building the book. And I have to be very clear that as a multiply disabled person who's immunocompromised, who is basically, you know, shelled up in this house in Oakland where I'm not really leaving the home because of that risk, even if I am masked, like it's very, you know, minor things. But you know, what has changed for me as the editor. And so one big chunk wasn't just like more reflecting on like, okay, here we are 2 years later, this is what has happened. But it was also like, let me tell you what I was doing in the back end. You know, let me tell you what was happening in the background that you didn't know was happening to make this book a reality. And that was reaching out to people who I trusted and who I knew loved me and respected the work, and who would follow the work to its end if I died because of whatever. And I know it sounds like, I don't know, however it sounds, sad, grief-stricken, whatever.
It's
But
real.
for me, yeah, I'm like, that's the reality. Like it still is the reality. You know, I'm going to an estate planning workshop this month. You know, like those are the things specifically for queer people, but like those are the things like I'm thinking about when it comes to like succession planning, which to me is also a gift that we give people. There's so many people that are still in positions that they should have left 10 years ago, right? Like the people who just take up the space and don't get out of the way for growth and evolution, that's a problem. Like that is erosion and that is a misuse of power. So being honest about, I reached out to this friend and Cielo said yes. If something happens to you, tell me where the stuff is, tell me what you want to have happen. I will then, you know, introduce myself to the authors. And like I had a plan, like this is how the phone tree looks. You know, this is the person who's going to reach out to these people. This is the email that you're going to send to folks that I wrote. And maybe it seems like too much, but like I was in it. I was like a good friend died. Many of my friends' parents died. Like we were all grieving a lot. And I was like, one of the ways to cope with my grief is to tell people how I want to be celebrated and honored and the work that I want to have be wrapped up. Because I know too often people don't do succession planning and people are impacted negatively. And I did not want people to work so hard on their chapters and this book not get published because I'm dead. Like there's no reason for that to happen, right? And so I'm even thinking about like what are the departments or the places that are going to get my archive? You know, where am I going to house that archive that I have of my work in this field? So it's that kind of consideration that I was thinking through in writing that chapter, because it's so important to the work and to also envisioning like what else is possible. So that was a lot that was going on the back end, in addition to, you know, just struggling. Writing is hard. Writing is so hard. And we do so much hard work quietly that it feels very insular. So even, you know, when we had those writing spaces together, I needed it just as much as they did. You know, one of those requests for an extension, that was because of me, because I was like, I can't get out of bed. And I'm behind, I edit people's stuff or whatever. And some of them were because there were just more than 5 people who were like, I can't do it. So, you know, being honest about that, I think rehumanizes us for each other, but also for the work that we're doing and for the community that we're a part of, which I think is just such a beautiful gift that we give ourselves and other people to practice interdependence in that way, but also a really core element of what a liberatory pedagogy can offer, a liberatory andragogy of like rehumanizing ourselves, coming back into ourselves is so, so vital and important. And I think that's what happened for a lot of people who are writing their chapters and reflecting on their work. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm so excited. And I'm excited to see this grow and the conversation that comes out of it. I think what really stands out also, there's a lot of things that stands out, I keep saying that, but one thing that stands out is that you did list it, or you named it an archive, which archives grow. Any plans of growth on this, or how you see this growing, or you're just like, you know what, can I just celebrate this and then I'll get to it later, which is very real too.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, there's a couple of people who are like, I want to be in the book, but I can't do it. And they were like halfway through their chapters and important chapters, right? Like
Hmm.
important chapters about like intra-racial incestual experiences in Black communities. Like
Hmm.
I know that chapter needs to be published with the poem, right? Like, and so I want to do that. And so even throughout the intro, there's like a conjuring, right? Like it's even an index where I'm like, a conjure, go read what the conjuring is. For all of us to like collectively be like, yeah, I do want a second round. Yeah, I do
Hmm.
want a second volume. I haven't reached out to the editor to like bring that to fruition yet. We just had like our 6 month of check-ins around like sales and things like that.
Hmm.
But I do envision this being a volume set. And yeah, it's not going to come out like every year necessarily, but
For
I
sure.
know it's definitely going to come out and it's going to now have people who are like, you know what, I want to write something. You
Hmm.
didn't ask me, it's not an invitation only, but and I think that's a good thing. Like this was an invitation only text
Hmm.
because I knew I didn't have money to pay people what they should be paid. But this next round, my hope is that people will reach out and say, I want to write, I want to publish something, and I want it to be in this book. And also for my own work, you know, there's things that, you know, my friends are like, why didn't you publish your work about how you build your classes or, you know, how you change this training that's really important to our field? And I'm like, well, I'm not ready to write it
Yeah.
all down just yet. And I'm still thinking about where I want to publish that stuff. So I still have a lot of those thoughts held it's within me that I'm imagining. And so, yeah, I definitely want to invite people to like conjure a second, third, and fourth volume and edition to really help it expand and grow as our communities and the world changes. And also, my hope is that like when I'm no longer here on the planet and I'm Stardust, somebody else would be like, you know what, I'm gonna pick up what Bianca did and I'm gonna continue. And now we're gonna have like the 12th edition or the 12th volume or whatever it is. So I really want it to evolve and build and shapeshift and become what it needs to become for the moment in time that's going to be published.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So basically what you're saying, your DMs are open. No.
My
Do not clog
unaccessible
up.
opinions, right? Like, I mean, yeah, that's the thing. We're accessible on purpose, or like people can find us for a
Like,
reason. So, like,
yes.
yeah.
So I hope folks are reading this book and really pull out. I pulled out so much. So I think that a lot of folks will pull out in a lot, and then they will also get inspired and hopefully will be a part of your second, third, fourth edition. So hopefully this inspires a lot of folks.
Thank you.
Um, so I do have a few questions in the chat, so we could get started with that.
Great.
So a question from the audience. Do you have any hopes or recommendations of how someone might explore the book in a self-directed way, if you're not a formal educator or professional? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I would say read the titles of the chapters can be one way and read the thing that interests you the most, right? So if you're interested in hearing what Cypher has to say, because Cypher was featured in an award-winning film about intersex activists, then go read that one first. You know, if you're like, I'm into art and queer art and how we're, you know, archiving that, then go read my interview with Juan. You know, like those are really good ways to think about what it is that you want to read. But what I usually do when I'm considering a book that I want to read, I usually go to the index. And this is one of my favorite things to do to like determine whether or not a book is worth my time, is to look at the index and read what it is that they've identified as core topics that show up in the book. And for me, like if I'm reading a book about sex and sexuality and there's no conversation about race or class or gender or ethnicity or culture, why am I going to read it?
Yeah.
Like, that sounds like a menu at
Those books are already done.
yeah, exactly. I don't even read that in 2024. And so for me, like I'm really proud that we have, you know, things like Ricky Martin in the, you know, index. And it's like, oh, let's see how, you know, they talk about Ricky Martin. I'm also really excited that we have things like safety
Mhm.
and, you know, talking about like transformative justice. Like there's just so much here in ways that I think are really helpful and useful. And so for people who are like, oh, I want to read about porn literacy, but when do you talk about pornography? When do you talk about what's pornographic? Those are in 3 separate chapters, you know, so you can read those, you can bunch them together in a particular way. So yeah, so I think it's important to consider what to read, but I think going by what interests you the most is good. You can also start by like reading the lesson plans, you know, like and really
Yeah.
understanding like, oh, this is a question around language. How did you learn about this? That could be a useful thing, and then reading the chapter. right? So there's so many ways to engage with this. You do not have to read it in the way that we traditionally linearly encourage people to tell stories and to think. This is deeply rooted in like an Afro-Caribbean, like you know, wild, fantastic, ever-evolving spirit and legacy. And so yeah, it's gonna feel a little chaotic if you do that way, but that's life. Like life is chaotic.
Yeah.
So you're really getting the most, I think, if you do read it from bouncing around and from a nonlinear lens. Yeah.
I'm a fan of bouncing around all the time. I mean, I think it just makes, for me in my brain, how it works, it makes sense to kind of sometimes pick and pull, because sometimes you may not be in the mood for this one section or maybe heavy. And then you're also getting different perspectives. You're getting different ideas. So when I get an anthology, I'm like, yeah, this works with my brain. So yeah, I
Absolutely.
appreciate that,
Yeah.
because otherwise
Yeah.
you're reading, the same thought.
Yeah.
So another question is, how have your exploration of non-Western sexual practices informed our perspectives on Western sexuality?
Yeah, that was decades. I feel like decades and decades of work. So it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen within the year that we were doing this in the pandemic. It was like a slow evolution. It's a process, right? And so for me, it really started with me thinking about like what were my early memories of pleasure, of oppression, of fear, of joy. What is my earliest memory in general, and what were the things that were, showing up in that way? And that was really helpful for me to understand, like, oh, I'm 5 and I can remember the hair being cut from my head
Mm,
because I had, anti-Black grandparents who were like, you look too Black with your big old afro. So let's
mm,
just cut it down and get rid of all your curls. And so the fact that I have this early memory of just seeing my curls fall to the ground and my feet just like hang in the air, I'm like, that's such a deeply gendered experience where I remember looking in the mirror and be like, people are gonna think I'm a boy, and having that fear because of the anti-Black racism and colorism and all of that folded together, right? So that part of the reality was a part of also my healing journey and process, because being clear about like this was a traumatic, coming into the human sexuality field was a traumatic decision, right? Like
mm,
it traumatized me. I have a lot of hurt, I have a lot of scars, I have a lot that standing up, that fighting back, that saying, hey, you're wrong, or hey, I'm gonna gently correct you. And people don't like that. And we know what people were talking about, and they did not like that. And they shut me down, they called me out, they ganged up on me, they stole my shit. Like all the things you can imagine that we already know happens, that definitely happened to me, right?
mhm,
And so healing from that, it was the reminder that this is empire, right? Like I don't have to believe what empire is telling me. I get to believe people. So
mhm,
really separating those two and recognizing that, people are really invested in a sense of power, but they don't have a sense of collective power. And that to me is the really devastating part, where people aren't thinking about how to strategically use their power to create change that's sustainable,
mhm,
and understand that change takes time. So just because you got one person on the board who's different from everybody else, that's not enough, right? Like all these DEI plans, like that, we're seeing how that's crumbling now because it was just really not a fully invested approach in doing the work and
mhm.
helping make our systems better.
Right. It's kept
So
in the
yeah,
theory, not focus on
yes.
practice.
Oh,
Mhm,
absolutely, yeah. So I feel like all of my training around unlearning and relearning a Western perspective, understanding what empire looks like. And also like, my family's Puerto Rican. So I grew up in a home that was already deeply saturated in resistance and an anti-colonial language and legacy. Um, I grew up knowing that we were forced to have US citizenship. Like I knew
mhm,
that it wasn't a choice. I knew these things, and also the history of the island, other people who had oppressed, and other empires that were a part of this legacy, blah blah blah. So for me, it was I had a very different upbringing where we were always talking about, look at what's changing in Puerto Rico. I remember being
yeah.
16 and being in Puerto Rico and being like, why are there armed military up and down the streets? And it was because of this drug trade and the drug war, right? And seeing the same thing when I was living in New York City post September 11th. Same thing. The armed guards look at 18 years old with like machine guns, drawn just to help me feel safe. That
Right.
does not make me feel safe at all. But those experiences were a part of me being like, what does it do to young people when they're going to high school? And then I only have to go through like a metal detector, but now they also have to pass by a trained, armed militia with their like big old dogs just
Yeah.
to walk through Penn Station to get to wherever they want to get to. So those were really helpful in thinking about systems and places and spaces. Um, so it's really hard to identify like one thing or one experience, but it was a massive amount of experience. And it was also doing a lot of listening and a lot of work quietly. So a lot of reading, a lot of asking questions and listening with my whole body to the answer, not just listening with my ears, right?
Right.
So yeah, it was not just one thing. It was a multi-pronged approach for sure.
Nice. We have another question. You mentioned wanting to learn from younger generations. Is there anything that you are hoping to engage with? Anything that is currently sparking interest in this field or other areas?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the ways that young people are organizing using social media. I think they're really going to shift the way that we're thinking about AI, artificial intelligence. I know
Oh,
a
yes.
lot of white people in our field love it. I am like, what? What? We should not like we're living through Terminator and RoboCop. Like, why? Like, um, so learning from them what is and isn't gonna fly or do well or be sustainable. But also I think, they're the future of movement building. The fact that
Mhm.
they all were able to plan a nationwide school walkout on Snapchat for gun violence,
Yes.
I mean, high fives all around, right? Like you're a G, you know how to do it. And the fact that like I'm just using Snapchat for the filters, right? Like those I think are things that are really important, but it's a reminder that I need youth mentors, right? So I
Mhm.
know that all the time we're like, oh, get mentors, get mentors. And we always think it has to be people older than us.
No.
I got a youth mentor that just turned 21. I got a
Mhm.
youth mentor who's 10, and it took time to build relationships with their parents in order to build relationships with them, but I'm learning from them, right? Like I'm learning like, oh, this is what that word means, but also, oh, this is the way that you're viewing this in a different way. So even though I'm like rolling my eyes because they think they came up with these nuts, I'm like, you didn't.
Right.
Let me introduce you to this Snoop Dogg Dr. J song. Um, but it's good to hear them think through stuff and witness how they're receiving the correction and the information. And really it's I don't know if I just invite people to talk to young people as the human beings that they are, no matter
Mhm.
what their age is. So I'm one of those adults that will not do like baby talk to a
Oh,
toddler and a
same.
child. Like
No.
I will talk to you as a human being. I will say thank you for letting me come to your house. And while you're napping, I won't take it personally. Like that to me is a way of like building a relationship. And I take it seriously because if I'm invited to somebody's home, I might not pet the dog, but I'm like, thanks, dog. I know this is your house and I'm not gonna pay attention to you. But you
Mhm.
can sniff me, you can lick me. Like to me, that's just a form of like respect and care. And so I feel like we have so much to learn from them and so much
Mhm.
about archives, especially as we talk more about clouds and all the things. I don't even know what else. But I'm really excited also for what's going to happen around net neutrality and open access.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
that is to me the issue of their generation. And we don't talk enough about it. And for people who are like, what's net neutrality? It's literally having an open access to the internet without having anything interfere with us and our
Mhm.
ability to access something, being able to get the knowledge that we want. Right now, the US doesn't really have good net neutrality laws. We have a couple. We just had a decision to revert back to the Obama um, uh, agreements around net neutrality, which is a good thing, but it's from like 2018. Anyways, so that to me is going to be really interesting to see the way that they evolve those laws and being able to access whatever we want to know about on the
Mhm.
internet. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to lift that up too, because where we get our information is the internet, where
Mhm.
we do our research. I mean, I'm shout out to the librarians and the libraries that are staying open and the funding that's still happening. Um, but we're not touching, you know, books. We're not going through the catalogs anymore. We're not, you know, as much. And so it looks different. So definitely, I know some folks are just like, it's just the internet. All you do is be on social media, but social media is a way I get information too.
Right. Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
like,
I'm devastated with the way that Twitter went down, you know, because like that's
oh,
how I used to get my news stories. And now I'm just like, I don't
I
trust
don't know
it.
what
I'm
it is. I
Yeah,
don't
and
know
I'm
what
still
Twitter is.
look, and I will dead name it. It's still Twitter to me, and you know I will
Same.
do it to that, but not to people. But you know, still.
Exactly.
Anyway, so yeah.
No, I feel you. Couple more questions. How can people in the mental health field slow down and cope with the pressure to constantly learn the next best thing?
Mm, that's such a good question because I think it's a couple of things, right? One is that people, especially therapists, they want to learn, they want to do better, they don't want to cause harm, they want to stay up to date, and they're required to for licensing in almost every state. So that totally makes sense to me. I don't think it's a bad thing to want to learn, but I want to remind people that in order to become someone who has, and I have a contradictory relationship with the word expertise, but for you to have a particular level of expertise, you need to hone in on it. You need to spend time with it. But then you also need to leave it alone and go to like a Shakespeare class. Um, and that will just help you tap into that creativity. I think a lot of people forget how important art is to our liberatory movements. And a lot of us learned about the liberatory movements because of the art. And so if we're separating ourselves from that type of work, and I'm not here saying go to an art therapy class. No, go to a class for like creative writing or something.
Yeah.
Let your brain rest in a particular way. That's a requirement of having to really take the time to hone in and nurture that experience. I think so many people also are encouraged. I don't know if this is what it was like for you, that once you finish your dissertation, make it into a book. It's a really common thing that the Academy encourages people to do. And I just want to let people know that like your committee were just 3 people. Like they were not the whole world. And I know you did like what you think is an exhaustive, you know, academic research, bibliography, whatever. But there's so much more, right? Like if you really were like, oh, what else can I learn if I go read a Twitter thread using this hashtag? You know, what can I learn by reading more memoirs? I think those are the pieces that I encourage a lot of therapists to do, but also thinking, you know, using their own language, like the self of the therapist. Or this, you're not a rasa tabla, you're not like this blank slate, right? Like you are a full human being. And what is, you know, are you comfortable crying with your client? Why do you have to buy into this idea that you have to dehumanize yourself to be the best kind of therapist? Can you laugh with your clients? Can you, you know, disclose certain things that are comfortable for you to share that might bring you closer together? You know, and that requires you to be with other people. That requires you to be with the artists and the lovers and the sex workers and the people who aren't just therapists like you. It requires you to get trained by people with a different modality. And I always encourage therapists to also like expand their referral list. One of my big things is, why are you only referring to other medical providers and clinicians? That really pathologizes people's experiences. Why aren't you referring to an educator who maybe has a coupon code and can take someone to like the toy store and help them figure out what works for them or what books are available or I don't know, whatever else. So really expanding our referrals to include not just other people in their specializations who are therapists, but the rest of us too. So yeah, I feel like it's not just one answer, there's multiple things. Is there anything you would add to that question as well?
Yeah, so I I call it using my left brain. I need to turn off my right brain and use my left brain. So I recently got into pottery for a while. I'm recently now into building Lego botanicals. I'm now like I'm just trying to shut off. I think ever since my dissertation there, I was just like, I gotta shut off the academic brain sometimes. Like I found fantasy books and YA books, and I just feel like I understand sometimes we want to polish our skill, like you said, our expertise and stuff, but you gotta rest your brain. You gotta shut off your right and turn on your left, however it works. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's kind of been my coping skill,
Mhm.
because I feel like And I think it makes it very difficult for a lot of us, especially folks who are part of the global majority. It's hard for us to feel like, are we in the right place? Is our expertise right? Did we say that right? We're always like second guessing ourselves because we've been second guessed our whole time. And so you try to put more work into it to prove to yourself and others,
Yeah.
you got it. Go play
Right.
with your Legos. Go,
Exactly.
you know what I'm saying? Go to pottery class or something. But yeah, and I was almost, when you said what did you say? The art, what did you say? The art therapy certificate class. I was close to taking a pottery certificate program because I was like, well, I'm gonna learn this pottery thing and I'm gonna get a certificate out of it. Why? Why do I need to let me just go to the community center? Let me just go to, I don't need to do all that.
Right.
Actually, this goes into our next question around like discussing our role of rest and self-care practices while doing the work of reclamation and creation in the field and space. So I just feel like rest and self-care is so important. You just have to just shut it off and just step outside of yourself. You actually learn more when you're able to go out to other fields, kind of basically write with your left hand if you're right hand, you know what I'm saying? Like you just have to step away. And I know it's hard. And if many folks are, still in their programs, it's hard. It's like, when do I have time to read a book for fun? Or when do I have time to go to a pottery class? Like I get it. We get it 100%. But at some point, we gotta take a walk. We gotta we gotta get out. So what are your recommendations around rest and self-care?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of rest, and not just like, oh, I'm not gonna do anything, but literally like not even letting your brain process stuff, right? So like just be there, just be still, just acknowledge, just say thank you. I don't know, but just notice, right? Your surroundings, just like be still. And know that you don't have to produce anything. You don't have to do anything in
Say
that
that
space.
again. You don't have to produce
Anything.
anything.
Yep. I think that's the hard thing. We're in a capitalist society, so we're told that we should produce and produce and produce. That's what makes us valuable. But we're inherently valuable, as the Combahee River Collective reminds us as Black women, that like we know that and we should nurture that. And I think, what additional things that I do, not just like idly like laying around, but and like letting my partner touch me in the ways that brings them joy, really reconnecting to my body in ways that I'm not immediately thinking about. But also I love to float in water, right? Like, and that's another thing. Like for me, like one, I love the ocean and it's not always
Oh,
possible to
same.
get there. So like being in a body of water where I can just float and feel weightless and know that like I'm gonna be held, and with the complexities of whatever gravity is and the expansiveness of water, like my concerns about my body go away because the water's like, I'm here, we're gonna do our thing, whether you're here or not. So come on in. That's a good way for me to also like just be still, is to be like, oh, I'm floating. So that's really been helpful. But also like telling my people I'm having a hard day,
Yes.
texting them and being like, can we get a phone date together? And I have friends all over the country, right? And all over the globe. So figuring out like a 4 or 5 hour difference can be hard sometimes, but it's totally possible. So really being open to what else. I mean, when my mom died in 2016, I couldn't sit and read a book beginning to end anymore. Like my brain, the capacity to read and understand really kind of diminished. And I slowly started to get back in that by reading graphic novels and comic books, right? Because that was using a different way of reading. It's the media literacy piece, right? Of like looking at the images, considering what's there, what am I reading into it? And this is part of why I love like watching shows with the audio description on and the
Yes.
captions, because I will miss all sorts of stuff. I'm like, oh, that person's supposed to be there in the corner. Didn't even notice them. And now, okay, I'm watching this again. Great. So, accessibility is really a way that I found some self-care is like, what are the ways that can make this accessible for me? And, sometimes I just gotta walk outside and just be in the sun for a minute, let my skin feel the heat, and then turn back around before the bugs can get me. So there's ways to do it, and I'm not perfect at it. There's other times where I'm just like, I just want to eat this lemon cake
Okay.
in the room, so really releasing that idea that there's a right way to take care of myself and there's a wrong way. That's a duality and a binary that I think is a scam. But also, challenging this idea that like, I'm going to figure it out. I don't know how to know all the answers right now. And so sometimes it means that I'm going to play with my makeup. Sometimes it means I'm going to do my nails. Other times it means that I'm, going to stay a little bit longer in the shower. There's just so many ways. And for me, in my grieving, now I'm thinking about it, one of the ways I was able to come back into my body was by having different sensations. So like I had stopped drinking soda pop, but when my mom died, all I could feel was grief and fogginess. And I started drinking soda again just to get that burn down my throat. I needed to feel something else. I think it's a very similar thing for me when I was like, what can I do to just come back into my body and mind? And I just turned things into a ritual. So bathing became a ritual, eating, putting lotion on my body, rubbing my scalp, all that became a ritual. And that really helped me move through the time and the space. But also, like you said, painting and drawing and doing puzzles and baking. Yeah, all the things.
All kind of stuff and it doesn't, I feel like self-care is switched to, you have to buy something, you have to go on a trip, and it's like, sure, if you got it, but I mean, there's other ways to make sure you nurture your body and not spend an arm and a leg or enroll into another program. You do not need another program, y'all.
Right.
Finish this one and then see how you feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And the final question, will you be offering a reading group or study group of this book? It would be so great to connect with others and build relationships around the readings.
I haven't thought about it yet. We're still, the book just came out beginning of August last year. So we're still open to like hosting events and things. And I'm really giving the contributors a moment to just figure out like how do they want to move with this new, citation on their resume and CV and their information out there in the world now. Like how are they managing that? Because they get to decide what level of privacy they want and don't want. I've definitely been thinking about what else is there to offer. I definitely want to pay them for sure in that way if we have them in as like guest speakers to share a little bit about the chapter. So I think there's many ways to do it, but I'm also hopeful that like people will do that as community on their own too, and practice with each other. So it doesn't have to be me guiding it. Like the book is literally for everybody to do it the way that it works for them and the way that it resonates with them and the way that they learn. So I'm gonna invite people to consider how can I make this happen on my campus, in my community, at my library, online, because that's also a huge possibility. And that brings in so many more of us to participate too. Yeah.
I appreciate that. This was a beautiful conversation, and I hope folks feel inspired, whatever that might look like, inspired to rest, inspired to write, inspired to create, or have difficult conversations with folks. Are there any final thoughts or any final takeaways you want folks to leave here with?
Let's see. If you're thinking about coming into the human sexuality field, or if you're already here, know that you deserve to be here if you want to be here. You probably deserve a lot more than what it is that you're experiencing for sure. And there are ways to do the work differently than the way that you've been trained. A lot of my time in my graduate program was literally taking notes about what we weren't talking about. So if you're in a program and you're like, what is this? Why am I learning this? Identify the gaps, because that's how you can then build the work that you want to do. You then get an outline of, oh, we didn't talk about this abortion. Now I know to look for these resources. So that really helped me when I was like, I don't need to know about another Masters and Johnson research article. Like I understand what the Kinsey Institute does, but they're not doing it with my communities. So it's not to like diss them, but it's just to acknowledge like that's not relevant to me and the communities that I work with. So those gaps give you information too. So document them, identify them, and know that we're out here. We've been here, we're doing the work. And you can find us. You just got to ask around. And many of us are like 1 or 2 degrees from each other.
Okay, yes. And I really want to stress that you can also curate your own syllabus and challenge it, ask questions. Why this author over this author? ask those questions and challenge and bring in those readings, because a lot of the times folks might reusing the same syllabus, right? Like, this worked before, it's going to work again, but it might not, because things are evolving. So let's evolve with time. Shoot.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much. It was so good.
Oh, this was great. This was great. Thank you all for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation with Bianca. This so grateful. Definitely get the book if you don't have it, and dive in and enjoy it. So with that, thank you all, and y'all have a great night. Good night.